Good afternoon, everyone. We're just waiting for a couple more people to join us, and then we'll get started in about a minute or two. Thanks for joining us today.
I always feel like there needs to be music whilst
Yeah,
we
I
wait.
know, like a little elevator music, a little
Yeah.
background going on. I know you never know how many people to expect either, so
Yeah.
we'll get started here in about. I'll wait till it's 4:01, 4:02, and then whoever is late, it's their fault.
Yeah. Anna, where in the world are you right now?
Oh, I'm in London. Yeah. So, where are you in London as well?
Buckinghamshire, so just
Okay.
outside.
You
Yeah.
moved out. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice. Have you been there the whole pandemic, I take it?
No, just since January. I moved out of London in August and went to stay temporarily in Hertfordshire, but moved here where we're kind of like planning to stay to settle. Yeah. But yeah, so yeah, it's weird moving out of London, but also nothing has happened. So
Yeah. I feel like it's a good time to do it too, because why not?
yeah, exactly.
We moved apartments in London, so now we get to take our like daily walk in a different neighborhood, which at first was quite novel. Now we're sick of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, we've got about 12 people with us, so I guess it's as good a time as any to get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. With us today is Codrea Rado. She is the author of You're the Business, which is a new book that is all about freelancing and everything you need to know, from tax advice to pricing to self-care. It is such a freelance Bible. I couldn't recommend it more as a freelancer. You might also be familiar with her work because she's an accomplished journalist herself, first and foremost, which is what gives her so much expertise. She's started a newsletter for freelance journalists, which is called The Lance, and has all this kinds of advice. I'm sure the book is kind of an accumulation of so much that she's kind of offered us over the past year through that. And she also is a host of a podcast called Is This Working? So you might be familiar with her work from any number of these places, but I highly recommend that you follow her. And thank you so much for being with us today, Anna.
Well,
Welcome.
thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So my first question for you today here at Frontline Freelance Registrar is, you obviously have a freelance journey yourself, and much of which led you to writing this book. And I was wondering if you could tell us that story and what led you to create this book for us.
So my freelance journey started with a redundancy. So I've been a journalist my whole career, pretty much. And always knew I wanted it. Well, always knew. I was at university, and that's when I realized I wanted to be a journalist, and went ahead and pursued that career path. And it was 2017, and I was working as an editor in-house and got made redundant. And I decided that I was going to give freelancing a go because it was something that I had always thought that I really wanted to do, but was too scared to take the leap by myself. So when I got pushed and I didn't have a job to lose, I thought, well, I might as well try this. There was quite literally nothing to lose. So I got made redundant on a Friday and started freelancing on the Monday. And you mentioned I write a newsletter. I started that newsletter that very first week that I went freelance. So I actually started writing it exactly 1 week, probably two, not quite to the minute, but pretty much around the same time, because I send my newsletter around 2 o'clock on a Friday, and that's around the time I got made redundant. So I started writing a newsletter and sending that out on a Friday, and I didn't really have any kind of necessarily sort of solid plans with that newsletter, but it very much became a place where I would chart the journey of my freelancing experience. And I started writing about the highs and lows of freelancing, and it just kind of grew an audience quite sort of organically. And that is very much the birthplace of the book, because I kind of thought this is great to do this in a newsletter format. And I think it very much works in a newsletter format. But it very quickly became apparent to me that it would be a really good idea to have it all in one place and have it as a book and have it as something that you can reference, like that, there is an index in the book. And that was an active decision, because it's a kind of book that, sure, you can read it from cover to cover, and I would love if people did that, but I think that the majority of people will turn to it when they need the specific page or chapter or reference point that they are kind of looking for. So yeah, that's kind of the sort of like the origin story of the book, and also why I went freelance. But what kind of also is a big part of this story is that I did realize very quickly, my experience at least has been that it is really hard to make your living just full-time freelance journalist, without kind of, where you're just sort of pitching to traditional media outlets, magazines and newspapers. And so I've always been very interested in diversifying my income, exploring other creative projects, finding other ways to basically fund my freelancing. And so that's kind of also a big part of the journey as well. And that's something I talk a lot about in the book, about, developing multiple income streams. That's something that I think is applicable to all types of freelancers, but particularly creative freelancers and people like journalists and writers and that kind of thing. So yeah.
Well, that's a big thing I wanted to ask you about. And also, sorry, I forgot to say this in the beginning, but at the end of the session, we're going to have a Q&A. So hold your questions, and hopefully we'll have some time for Anna to respond. You talked about diversifying your income and having multiple income streams. And I know that a lot of us on the call today are probably journalists, with this being the frontline freelance registrar. And as you mentioned in the book, we're typically writing an article or producing a video or something for a flat fee. And so, one of the challenges of freelancing is kind of doing all this pitching and juggling these commissions, and not necessarily being able to budge much in one way or the other, without kind of having a whole negotiation and things like that. So I wanted to ask you about your experience with doing that, and also, the way you talk about money in the book, I thought was so interesting, because it's kind of divided between talking about money and getting over the fear of talking about money, and then also just the concrete aspect of funding your business. So can you talk about your journey with that and why you made those choices for the book?
Yeah, so again, from my experience of my own freelance journey, something that I realized very quickly is that you, as a freelancer, you have to get comfortable talking about money, because you pretty much have to do it on a daily basis. If you're not actively talking about money on a daily basis, you probably are thinking about it. When you work in-house, you negotiate your salary when you join a company, and maybe if you're lucky, you get that annual review where you can ask for and then not receive a salary increase. But when you're freelance, you are negotiating rates for every project. You're pricing your services, you're worrying about budgeting for your tax. All of this stuff is happening pretty much all the time. And so there is no way to avoid that. Doesn't matter how big, how successful, how much money you make. That's just a fact about freelancing. So it's really important to get comfortable with it. So that's sort of a specific money thing about freelancing that to me is so key and so important, that there was no way I couldn't just, I wanted to make that kind of front and center in the book. But then also kind of like beyond that, I have always felt that, money is such a taboo subject, and particularly for women, I just think it is so important. Financial transparency is so important because being financially independent is a feminist issue. It is really important to have the confidence to kind of talk about these things, and also the knowledge to dismantle the structural inequalities that cause these various pay gaps that we kind of face. So that's something that has always been kind of like something that I felt very strongly about long before I was freelance. And so I just wanted to just really openly talk about money in the book. And also, there was such a kind of mystery about freelancing to me, particularly, freelance journalism, especially. I before I did it, I was trying to kind of like make the sums work, and it just never quite seemed to work when I would sort of try to multiply what the kind of average rate was by how many articles I thought I could produce. And I was just like, something isn't adding up here. And I then realized that, a lot of other freelance journalists are supplementing their income in another way. And there's a couple of schools of thought to look at that. One is that there's a lot of talk about how people kind of like hide the fact that they have either independent wealth or a second source of income. To a large extent, yes, that might be true. There might be people who are just being financially supported through some other means, either by a partner or parents or whatever. I think that is just the case generally in the media. It's just a very broken industry where there are a lot of inequalities. So that is just kind of a problem. But then on the other hand, I don't think there's anything wrong with having your own independent income streams. I don't think there's anything wrong with creating ways for you to be able to make the space to do the creative work. Yes, it is deeply unfair, and it's a structural problem that we can't just get paid well on time for telling stories and reporting on the world and, being the fourth estate. And there are people who kind of campaign for this, and there are ways to raise awareness for that. But the problem is that it's such a big issue that it's not just going to get solved overnight. So whilst we kind of unionize or talk about collective action or campaign or whatever it is that we might do to kind of fix those big macro problems, there are things that we can do in our day-to-day freelancing that's just going to make our individual lives a bit easier. Like, it is possible to I think it's possible to pull both of those levers at the same time. So I'm really interested in kind of what are some like smart business choices that I can make to grow my business and to not kind of, there's a big difference between really not being, being paid so poorly that you're not able, the kind of like the starving artist idea that we have about a lot of creative, which I think does extend to journalists as well, that journalism is so poorly paid that you're never going to make any money, through to kind of making, being a millionaire. There is somewhere in the middle that is kind of like being financially independent and having enough money to be able to potentially buy a property or kind of like have a comfortable life, or take holidays and that kind of thing. And so that's kind of like where I'm coming from, and that's something that I think is really reflected in the book. And I just think I don't think that there has ever been anything bad that's come out of being very transparent and being very open about talking about money. And it's something that, my personal view is that in any industry which is so precarious like the media, it makes good sense to have multiple sources of income, so that if something were to collapse, you have other things to fall back on. Again, let's kind of look at how I even came to freelancing in the first place. I was in a job and it got quite literally pulled out from underneath me, and I had the job on a Friday and I didn't have it on the Monday. And there was no security around that. At that time, the company I worked for wasn't unionized. At least the office that I worked in wasn't unionized. I didn't have that support. The nature of the contract I was on meant that I didn't get particularly great redundancy payout. So I had gone from knowing exactly how much money was going to be in my bank account every month to not having any income. So in a weird way, I kind of actually feel a bit more secure now that I'm freelance, because I know that I have different ways that I make money, and I know what would happen if one of those were to disappear, that I have other things to fall back on. So yeah, I mean, it's also, money is such a complicated thing that so many of us have very emotional responses to, and is very much determined by our upbringing, our society, our culture. All of these things kind of influence how we think about and how we talk about money. So just kind of like opening that up a bit, was just really important to me.
That's super interesting. And I think that's so interesting what you say too about feeling more secure now because you have these different streams of income coming in. And I was wondering, one of the things you talk about in terms of like with the newsletter is sort of how that was a long-term project. Of course, probably your first newsletter that you sent, you weren't making any money from. And I was wondering what your advice is for people who are considering these streams of income that maybe they have a little bit more control over or might have a little bit more growth than something that's just a fee that they're going to get that
Mm.
they don't have much control over. What you would say to people thinking about that right now?
So there's a couple of things. One, I think it's great to kind of have your sort of own independent projects when you're a freelancer for a number of reasons. Let's take freelance journalism as a perfect example of this. There is the way that a typical freelance journalist works is you sell your article to a publication and you write that article and you get a fee for it. You're essentially exchanging time for money. And there is always going to be a cap on how much you can earn doing that, because there's only so many hours in the day, there's only so many articles that you can write. So if making money is part of is a goal, if kind of like, if you have certain income targets, which I guess to kind of like roll this back, like all of us have different income targets, and some people might feel that their income target and what they feel that they are, what they think that they can kind of do in terms of how much output they can produce and how many articles they can sell, there might be a gap between those two things. Like they may never feel like they're going to be able to hit that income target. Which is definitely the case for me when I kind of was sitting down and working out, okay, how much money would I ideally like to earn so that I can live comfortably, so that I can pay back then, my London rent and all of my expenses, plus try and save up money to buy a house and contribute to a pension and all of these things. There was quite a big gap there. So when you do certain types of projects like newsletters and podcasts, they are scalable in the sense that you make one newsletter, but you can either, depending on what kind of business model you have for it. So in my case, I had a subscription-based model. But the same is true for advertising. You can make in a sort of exponential amount of money from it, because you send the newsletter once, but there's in theory no cap to how many subscribers you can get for it, or how much kind of like advertising you could put, advertising revenue you could get from it is not dependent, is not an exchange of time for money, it's a value exchange. The same is true for podcasts, that you make it once, but if you have a big enough audience, you can sell a lot more advertising than you would get from exchanging your time for money if you were, let's say, writing that up as an article or something like that. So that's the theory. The problem is, of course, that there is no income stream that you can set up today that's going to start making you a huge chunk of money tomorrow. That's the problem. There are very few people who probably have been on I doubt there is anyone in this event today, if they already follow me and they already know my work, I doubt anyone has been a subscriber of my newsletter from the very beginning. Like there were, for months I was writing that newsletter in obscurity, and it was pretty much friends and family and a few people in my professional network who followed it. It took a long time to grow that newsletter. The same is true for kind of like, our podcast. It took a while to get enough listeners so that we could actually put together an advertising sponsorship proposal. That's not to say it's not impossible. It definitely is. And you don't need as many subscribers or as many listeners as you might think to start making money from it. But there is just that, you know, there's a lot of these kind of blogs that you'll read or books that you might see about passive income and making income in your sleep. I personally think that by and large, it's a load of crap, that kind of stuff. And that it's not possible. Like, if it was possible for us to shake the money tree and money to fall out of it, we all would be doing it, and we wouldn't be having these kinds of conversations. Like, it's just, you know, money just fundamentally, you can't get money for nothing. It just doesn't work. And so every kind of income stream is almost like a mini freelance business in and of itself. Some just have more potential to make you more money than others. Like, I just do believe that. I do fundamentally believe that I have kind of like the data, my own kind of like data to sort of prove this, that I can make more money from my newsletter than I can do from freelance journalism. I can make more money from sponsorship deals with my podcast than I can from freelance journalism. That's not to say that I kind of want to never do the journalism. It's just being realistic about where the money is, essentially, and just finding a way to kind of balance those two, and also learning the skills to actually kind of like build these income streams. And so people who are interested in doing this kind of thing, obviously I'm going to say buy the book, because it really outlines all the steps for doing it. But like, a real key thing that people need to be aware of is, if you're trying to build an income stream, because, you know, like so many of us, we've been so affected by the pandemic, and we've possibly had, you know, like travel writers, international correspondents, even like food writers. There are so many particular areas of journalism that has been so badly affected by the pandemic, that for a lot of us, we're trying to kind of find additional income streams because we desperately need them, when the reality is you need to give it the time to grow, and you need to kind of be really realistic about how much time you're going to have to put into this, to grow these things. And again, it's just all about kind of like treating it like a business, and just be so aware. And it's, you know, it's this, the same is true for my book. I got asked this today, what's something you'd wished you'd known about the book before you went into writing it? It's that the writing part was easy. It was everything around the book that was hard. It was finding the agent, getting the book deal. Now, you know, doing all of the kind of the marketing. Yes, I've got a publisher, so they do some of the marketing for me, but there's a lot of marketing that you yourself have to do as an author, and you have to basically write yourself a little marketing strategy and a plan, and kind of then execute it and sort of do all of that. And it's the same for all of these creative endeavors, be that freelance journalism, podcasting, newsletters, blogs, YouTube, whatever it is, that you will spend 20% of your time on the actual making and the content, and 80% of your time on everything else around it. And we can, of course, talk about kind of how not great that is, but it is just it's the reality of it. And I think that it's just really important to go into that. This is going to sound really weird, but if someone who isn't already freelance were to read my book and it were to put them off freelancing, I'd actually be quite glad of that, because I'm really not here to sort of advertise like how amazing freelancing is and how much it's going to kind of solve all of your work-based problems, and how easy it is, because it's not. It's just about, to me, it's about being really transparent and having these kinds of conversations, and just really understanding. Like, I'm more than happy. I pretty much, in the book, I pretty much lift the bonnet on my own freelance business and kind of like show it, because I think that's the only way that we can really sort of learn this stuff and understand, and kind of break down some of this opacity that exists around how people actually do this kind of work and how people actually make this work.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you did that and you didn't romanticize it. And you know, I still personally found it encouraging. Maybe that's because I'm a
Good.
freelancer, so it just goes to show that it's gonna hit different people differently. I was wondering, you know, you were just talking about sort of selling all these aspects of your freelance business. Of course, that's a big chapter of the book too, the DIY marketing. And I was wondering if, for people who, I think a lot of journalists can shy away from self promotion. I know I do. I was wondering if you can provide some advice for that, for people who don't find that a natural part of what they want to do.
So some of the best general career advice that I have ever heard, which I think is so applicable to anyone, no matter what you do, is that no one cares as much about your career as you do, and that you're the only person who is as invested in it. You know, you are your number one champion for your career, and it's on you to look after it. And that no mentor, no boss, no client, no one is going to care as much as you. So you need to believe in what you're doing, and you need to do everything you can to help you succeed. But to kind of, again, to take that step back, it's important to define for yourself what success means to you. Does it mean having X amount of money? Does it mean having bylines in this place or another? Does it mean doing work that helps people, covering certain stories, writing in certain formats, telling particular kinds of stories, whatever it might be? It's about defining success for you, and then essentially figuring out a way to get there. And I don't even really think of it necessarily as self-promotion. I sort of think of it as, there are things that I do. I essentially, whether I want to accept this or not, I am essentially a service-based business as a freelance journalist. I have a service. I report and write stories for newspapers. That is providing the publication with a very, very valuable service, because they need to fill their pages and their websites, and it's providing readers with a very, very valuable service. So it's not necessarily about self-promotion. It's about me believing in the value of my service, and then basically standing behind it and offering it to the client. In this case, it's the editors. So that's kind of my sort of hack for getting around that, and sort of just thinking a bit less about like promoting myself, and more just creating a bit of distance, and thinking it's more about, it's a service that's separate from me. And yes, of course, it's entirely dependent on my skills and expertise, but it doesn't determine my value, you know, just like my salary doesn't determine my value. The fact that I'm a journalist doesn't determine my value either, because that's the other thing. I think a lot of us journalists, you know, we tangle up, especially if you work for a publication for a long time. You sort of, where does that publication's brand end and you begin? So yeah, as journalists, we do tangle up a lot of our identity in the work that we do, and I do think it's really important to just try and create that bit of distance. And you know, it is hard, especially because social media has very much just become a place just to live tweet your CV. But again, it's such, it doesn't matter how good you are or how big you get. Just like you will always have to talk about money, you're always going to have to sell your services. If you look at large companies, I always sort of, something that gives me comfort is I kind of look at the business world in general and look at what big companies do. Coca-Cola continues to advertise, which I think is something that is really worth remembering, that they are a huge, huge multinational, God knows how many billions of dollars business. They still do their Christmas advert every year. Marketing and selling is still a part of what they have to do. They have a huge department that does it for them. You are all of the different aspects of your business when you work for yourself, but you will always have to be doing your marketing and sales. And you know, to a large extent, like what does marketing really actually mean when you are a freelance journalist? It actually means pitching. Like, that is what your marketing is. It's not actually being on Twitter. It's pitching. So, which I think is something that people kind of get confused about, that you know, kind of enticing people into your product is actually sending an editor an email to ask them if they want your product. So yeah, it's just kind of like, it's mindset shift, and trying to sort of shift into this business of one headspace, because freelance journalism is not just the work that you would have done in-house without the boss and without the office. It's you running your one person media band, and everything that comes with it.
I love so much of this about, being in service and sort of this mindset shift. And I thought that there was so much of this in the book, both sort of these much bigger, more holistic type tips, but also really practical things about financial advice or making yourself go on holiday and stuff. And I was wondering if you had to pick three of these tips in the book, what would be your top three, and how did your business change when you integrated them? And I guess your life change as well.
Great question. Okay, so the number one that comes to mind is having a work wife or work spouse, having kind of, freelancers. I will say this until the day I die. Your fellow freelancers are not your competition; they are your colleagues, and you need to basically surround yourself with these people. Oh, turn up my mic a bit, sure. So, oh, actually, I don't know which Anna it is. We're both Annas.
Computer is not great.
So yeah, fellow freelancers are not your competition, they are your colleagues. So it's really important to build a community around yourself, and it's as important as it is to network with the people who are going to give you the work. It's also important to do what I call the horizontal networking as well. So your peers, like that peer-to-peer networking, where you are building up a support system of other freelancers who you can talk to when things are hard, who get it. Sure, it's important to talk to your friends and family, but it's really more valuable to have other freelancers who understand what it is that you're going through, and to almost kind of like create your own sort of personal board of advisors, basically, that you can turn to. This is something that I've been really leaning on myself recently. I've got a couple of things that are changing in my business, and normally I would just make those changes without consulting anyone. But now I've actually taken the time to speak to other freelancers who I know and trust, to reason these things out with them before making my decisions. And I truly think that my business will be so much better for it. So that is one thing. The other thing is knowing your rights and learning your rights. This will be different depending on where you are in the world. Of course, the book is written from a UK perspective, and I pretty much outline all of the rights that you need to know in the book, but you don't need to read the book to figure that stuff out. You can learn this stuff elsewhere. And also, of course, if you're not in the UK, it will be a different situation depending where you are. It is so important to know your rights, because there is this narrative that freelancers have no rights, so therefore we should expect to be exploited. Yes, we don't have employment rights. Again, I'm speaking from a UK perspective. We don't have the same employment rights. We don't really have any employment rights, but we do have some rights, and particularly around payment, anti-discrimination. We do have a right to a pension. All of these things, we do have certain rights, and you need to know what you are entitled to so that you can fight for them. And also, again, to kind of challenge this idea that you are the little person and that you're coming up against a large company and that you're completely powerless. You're not. So those are kind of like, so learning your rights just really puts you in a much more powerful position to fight for them. And just to kind of like, not get taken for a ride by clients who are going to push their luck, or in some cases actively be bad clients. And then I guess I was going to say, it's also really important to learn to talk about money, but I think I've kind of like covered that point before, is to learn how to take care of yourself as well. I think that's something that all of us need to do right now because of the pandemic, but it's something that freelancers always need to do. And it's just really important to do stuff like put in your diary ahead of time that you are going to take this time off. Let's say you want to take 2 weeks off in September. You put that in your diary. It's this kind of there's been this trend recently about unlimited holiday at companies, particularly startups, where you have unlimited holidays. You don't have a sort of set number of holiday days, and actually the research has shown that people end up taking less time off because they don't want to be seen as slacking off or taking too much time off, so they end up undertaking fewer holidays. I actually think that it's a good idea to say to yourself at the beginning of the year, whether that's the financial year or the calendar year, part of my plan is that this year I'm going to take whatever, 20 days holiday, 30 days holiday, whatever you want, and kind of roughly plan out when that's going to be and put it in your diary so that when you are booking work, you're like, oh no, actually I can't do that project because I'm taking a break then. Because this idea that I'm freelance, I'm the master of my schedule, I will take my Friday afternoon off, no one does that. It very rarely works out like that. You end up going 6 months and you've not taken a single day off. So you kind of need to book those holidays in advance. And that's something that I've been trying to do. It's something that I've sort of, the first year I did that really seriously was the year before the pandemic. And then the pandemic kind of threw things out of the window. But it's something that I'm now kind of putting back into my business. And it's just such an important part of just being productive, because to truly be productive, you need to put rest time in. And we are not machines. You have to rest. And rest doesn't just mean ending the day, sitting on the sofa and then going to sleep. It means means having active rest, taking holidays, having a life outside of work, all of this stuff. So that's a really, really important part. And I'd say that it's something I really struggled with when I first went freelance, and it took a long time for me to realize it. But it's just really important. And again, it kind of goes back to this sort of like this money issue, because I think for a lot of freelancers, we think every day is worth X amount of money, because especially if you're paid by the hour, you think, okay, well, this day that I'm not working is costing me £200, £50, whatever it might be. And so I can't take that holiday because I'm paying the cost of the holiday plus all of the money that I have lost by not working on that day. And that's just get out of that headspace, because that's just going to mean you never take any time off and you burn yourself out, and actually you're more ineffective than if you would have just actually rested and kind of like looked after yourself first.
That's the freelance trap that you talk about.
Yeah.
You put really beautifully. So the pandemic has come up quite a few times in this conversation, and I know when I was reading the book, I was like, I bet this like came up when she was doing her edits and she suddenly realized she had to integrate this major thing that obviously changed work so much for us. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that and how that changed how you structured the book and even how you give advice through your newsletter.
That's a good question. So basically, the idea for this book happened way long before the pandemic, but I actually sold the book deal right at the beginning. I basically got the book deal around this time last year. But I had already written, so to get a book deal, you have to write 3 sample chapters and you submit them. And so those 3 sample chapters were written pre-COVID. I can't remember now which ones they were. One of them was the one about working from home, and one of them was about finances. So some of the chapters, obviously, there is not really any, there is no kind of like pandemic effect on them. It was a real difficult balance, because I do mention the pandemic at some points, but I don't mention it a whole lot, because it was quite hard to write the book basically in April 2020 and try to think, what is the world going to look like when this book actually comes out? Because it's basically a year's gap. So it was really hard to kind of think, I don't have a crystal ball, obviously, or I didn't have a crystal ball, still don't have one. So it's kind of hard to sort of do that balance. And I definitely didn't want the book to be entirely full of pandemic references and for it to potentially date. Because that is the other thing. I do really hope that, and the way I've structured the book is that it should have quite a long shelf life. Like, I do hope that this continues to be a very useful resource for freelancers for years to come. And so the pandemic then kind of became this, almost like this is one of the worst things that could happen that may affect your freelancing. And not just in terms of the pandemic itself, but also the recession and the economic impact of it as well. I think even when I was conceiving of the book, and there is a chapter about, when things go wrong, a recession was very much in the back of my mind as something that is likely to happen over the course of anyone who's freelancing now. They are likely to see a severe recession in the next 5 to 10 years of their freelancing business, because we know from history and from predictions that is likely to happen. So it was quite a difficult thing to kind of balance. Whereas, for example, with my newsletter, which is a lot more current, and it's almost like a mini publication, it's easier to talk in the kind of the here and now, and for it to be about, this is what's happening now, this is the direct impact of the pandemic on this aspect of my freelancing today. Whereas the book needs to kind of have that more sort of zoomed out element to it, which was definitely kind of like a challenge in terms of writing. I wasn't really used to doing that kind of writing or sort of thinking like that. However, this is not something that is totally uncommon for book editors to deal with, that the kind of the lead times on books are so much longer, that my editor really helped me navigate that, and I actually really let her input her thoughts about how we deal with covering the pandemic. And she was quite keen for, of course, we can't pretend it hasn't happened, but I think I probably had more references to it in there, which we then removed because it just didn't need to be there. And it's quite clear that, okay, this thing is obviously applicable in the to the pandemic, but also has applications beyond it. But yeah, it was a difficult thing to navigate, and that was definitely that kind of, I'm used to writing something and it appearing straight away, either in a newsletter or goes in print or online pretty quickly. The longest kind of lead times I've ever worked with before are print ones, which maybe a kind of a month or two, but never these kinds of this sort of scale of lead time. So that was definitely a learning curve.
That's a big difference between writing articles and writing a book.
Yeah.
So we've got at least one question and another 20 minutes or so. So so our question, it's actually a question I had for Anna before we got started. Are you considering other versions of your book geared towards specific countries like the US?
Yeah, I would love to, it's very simple. It's whether my agent can sell in those territories. I would love to do a US version. I worked in the US for about 5 years. So it kind of holds a very special place in my heart. I also feel like I do understand how it works. I was never full-time freelance there, but I know what it's like to work in the US. I know what it's like to be a journalist in the US. So I would love for there to be a US edition, but it's just whether the US publishers are willing to buy the US rights to it. But yeah, that's something that is being worked on at the moment.
And I do think that even, this UK version, there's a lot of concepts in it that, an American audience could definitely, use in terms of talking about pricing and talking about mindset and sort of constructing their life.
Yeah, I would say that 90% of the book is applicable wherever you are. There are specific sections about things like tax, or the benefits and the rights that you are entitled to. So we were talking about employment rights earlier. They are different here to the US, and also even within the US, it depends what state you're in, and all of this kind of stuff as well. So those things are, of course, would need to be changed. But by and large, everything about multiple income streams, all of that is applicable globally, because I don't know of anywhere in the world where there, the media kind of like ecosystem is pretty much the same everywhere. I don't think it's kind of that. I don't think kind of anything that I've said about in terms of how hard it is to be a freelance journalist, I think that's true in the US. If anything, I think it's probably harder because of the lack of publicly funded healthcare. So yeah, but by and large, those kind of like bigger picture things are applicable no matter where you are in the world. I think, though, unfortunately, I don't know if you can actually order a US copy to be sent to America. So it might be that you can't even actually get the book in the US, let alone the fact that it's not fully applicable. So yeah, you might just need to wait, see if I can get a US deal.
So there's another couple questions in the Q&A box. One is, I know you do more reporting, feature writing for your newsletter now, but how many readers / how much revenue do you think you need to have before that's worth doing, as opposed to just writing comment, which is less labor intensive, or instead trying to pitch somewhere? That's a really good question.
That is a great question. I'm not going to pretend, it is really hard. It is really, really hard. Because to do journalism independently in your own, it's almost, I do always kind of think of like, it's quite helpful to think of newsletters as little mini publications or little magazines anyway, because it kind of helps you get your head around all the different elements that you need to do to make it work. But yeah, so basically for anyone who doesn't know, so I recently switched switched up my newsletter to do original reporting in the newsletter itself and do kind of feature writing, both me covering it and also I commission other writers to do it as well. It's been very, very difficult because if I'm writing the pieces myself, I'm paying an editor to edit them, or if I'm commissioning a writer, I'm obviously paying them. And I had about 300 paying subscribers, and that still wasn't really covering the costs. So I think if you want to do a rigid, this is, there's a lot of conversation. I feel like there's a whole other conversation we can have about like newsletters and their role they play in the media ecosystem. There is not that many examples of newsletters that are doing original, because it just is a really hard sell. And it's also something that you can't really do part-time. You kind of have to put your all into it. And so my own experience is that it is less labor intensive to try and pitch stuff elsewhere. That if you're writing stuff for your own platform, it's because you're trying to build something bigger. You're trying to build your own publication, your own platform in that respect. And then of course, there's all the other stuff that comes with it. You may potentially need some kind of legal support, or like I said, editing or whatever it might be. So that, running your own reported publication as a newsletter is very difficult. Whereas, yes, when it's just commentary or it's sort of like more opinion led, it is just a bit easier. But again, it's not impossible. There are publications that do it, but it's not easy. And I'm very interested to see how this kind of section of the media ecosystem plays out, because I'm not convinced that it's going to kind of solve all of the problems that the media has. Whereas a kind of like first person quirky newsletter that you can make some income for, that supplements the other freelancing you do, I really believe that is more than possible. I mean, I did it for myself, so that I think it's just a very different proposition. So yeah, but like I said, I could talk about that for a long time. I think there's still a lot, there's kind of like a lot we don't know yet about what's kind of how the sort of newsletter landscape's going to unravel.
That's super interesting. Looks like we get to talk about it a little bit more, because the next question is, with the huge proliferation of newsletters and podcasts over the last year in and outside of journalism, what do you think will determine which ones succeed and which ones fail, specific to journalism related letters and podcasts?
It's a great question. I think also it's interesting. It depends what you mean by succeed and fail. If you're talking about, will they make enough money to cover the costs of running them? I think the ones who treat it as a business and as their own publication and put in, at least initially, put in the legwork and the hours needed to get that off the ground, they will succeed. I think that otherwise it's just very hard. I mean, these are essentially, again, these are mini businesses. And so much of the discourse around newsletters and podcasts, they're kind of sort of talked about from people who've not made them themselves or tried and got bored of them very quickly, is that they're thought of as this kind of like creative project that you pick up when you feel like it, or a place for the pitches that you've not been able to land elsewhere. It's kind of like a graveyard for them. It's not, these newsletters and podcasts that succeed are ones that are treated like their own they have their own editorial strategy. There is a content plan, there is a regular publishing schedule, there's a lot of care put into it. And again, ultimately, this kind of comes back to you have a product, a service. it's not about, can I create a newsletter that's going to make me money? It's, can I create a newsletter that people actually really want to read, that people will read, that people will allow into my inbox, that will grow a readership. The reason my newsletter did well and grew is because it had a very clear value for the people who subscribe to it. They're going to learn about, they're going to learn the tools that they need to build a freelance career. They're going to follow the journey of someone who's very open about freelancing, and in return they're going to learn really, really valuable stuff that they can't get elsewhere. And that was particularly the case also, again, as I mentioned, I started this newsletter 4 years ago. I'm fully aware that there are now so many newsletters that are about freelancing, but there weren't that many when I was doing this, when I originally started doing it. And it's the same with podcasts. It's not, again, we talk in these terms that are like, oh, we've reached peak podcast. There are now so many celebrity podcasts. There's no point in starting a podcast or a newsletter. I think that's kind of that sort of scarcity mindset isn't really the right way to sort of look at it, because there are so many TV shows, there are so many books. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't pitch a book idea. It just means that you have to be so clear on what your book idea is, the audience that it's going to serve, and how you're actually going to get it in their hands. And again, it's that same principle that applies to all of these, because it's all the same stuff. It's just content in different packages. The format might look different, but the core of it is all the same. And there is, of course, something unique to all of these formats. What makes a newsletter really special is that it's something that lands in someone's inbox. So there is a certain relationship that you kind of get. It's more like letter sending in the kind of digital age. So you need to really kind of like tap into that intimacy. It is a place to kind of be a bit more vulnerable and open, because I think people are happy to read about that kind of stuff in their inboxes. But also you do need to be really, really respectful of the fact that you're entering someone's inbox. And so if there's no clear value to them, they're either not going to let you in, or they're going to unsubscribe really quickly. Again, with podcasts, the unique kind of value proposition of the podcast is the fact that it is that audio in your head, and it's that kind of like private, it's almost like listening in on someone else's conversation. And so if you can really tap into that, or if you can, other podcasts that do so well are storytelling podcasts, which again are incredibly expensive and very difficult to produce entirely on your own. But why are they so good? It's because it's that very immersive experience that really lends itself to the format. And it's really important to sort of like understand how all of these things kind of like play out. And if you like, I'm all for people starting newsletters and podcasts. It's just be really clear on why you're doing it, and what value it's actually going to serve, who your audience is, and what value it is that it's going to serve to them. Because when you're just pitching stuff to publications, like, of course you need to understand the publication so that you can get your pitch right. Beyond that, you don't have to care. Like, you don't have to care what the Guardian readers are going to think of your long read or your feature or whatever it is. That doesn't actually really matter in just a pure kind of like business exchange, in the kind of like pure business transactional terms. You're selling your service to the editor. You're not interacting directly with the readers. Whereas when you're making a newsletter and a podcast, you are. So those are the people that you have to really worry about. I hope that answers it. Again, it's a really, really big topic.
I think that's so interesting. That's such a great way to put it as well. We're coming to the end of our hour, so if no one has any other questions, I want to know if there's sort of one last word of wisdom that we haven't discussed that you would like to leave everyone with.
I think we definitely covered the main things, but I think the only other thing that is really important to kind of mention is that it's absolutely, there's no kind of like right or wrong way to be a freelancer. Like, there's no kind of like, I should be doing this, I should be doing that. It's entirely for you to determine what success looks like for you, and for you to determine what kind of business you want and how you want to work and the types of things that you want to be doing. And that also extends to whether you do freelancing part-time, whether you do it to as a kind of stopgap while you're looking for a job. All of these things, there's I think because freelancers do have such a tough time of it, that there is this idea that, like, if I'm freelance, I've got to be freelance for life and I've got to be doing freelancing in this particular way. Like, you absolutely do not. You just there are some kind of loose rules that you probably should follow, mainly around your taxes, but beyond that, it really is for you to, if this is a hard way to work, like, actually make it work for you and kind of like put that effort into actually just being really happy and proud of being a freelancer. So yeah, I think that's kind of like my other big point.
Well, great. We have one last question, which is, do you have any tips for honing your pitching skills?
Learn the difference between a topic and a story, and pitch stories, and be just really clear on not only what the story is, but also why you, what kind of skills and expertise or access or sources you have, why now, what makes it timely. And then also, my pitches always come with a publication in mind, because that's kind of part of it. It's not just a story that exists in the abstract. I'm in so many WhatsApp groups, and like Slack groups and stuff for freelancers, where it's like, I've got this story idea, who do you think would be interested in it? I find that to me, that's just not how my brain works with my stories and my pitching. This is a story for this story in this format for this publication. Because if you don't have the publication in mind, it's like a very key missing component to it, because you have to know what's going to be unique about your pitch to that publication for them to accept it. And it's a really key part of it. So kind of try to sort of like move out of that kind of thinking of like, oh, I've got this cool story, who would be interested in it, to starting to learn, how do I how do I actually kind of find a place that is going to be a natural fit to it. But above all else, it's learning the difference between a topic and a story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that also that goes back to just sort of that value add and that business transaction, whether it's selling a story or pitching a newsletter, or maybe that goes into pitching for advertisers on a podcast that we didn't really get into, but would be a very interesting topic for another
Yeah.
day possibly. But anyway, thank you so much, Anna. This was so interesting and so great for our community as the Frontline Freelance Register. I mean, we're trying to build a community of freelancers and have that support for each other. So it just fits in so much with what we're trying to do. And if anyone wants to follow Anna, I would say on Twitter, she's at Anna Cod. And also, what's the best way to sort of follow your work, your favorite social media platforms?
Yeah, Twitter and Instagram probably. I'm at Anna Cod on both of them, and yeah, all of the kind of like links and stuff to all of my things are in there, and yeah, those are the main places that I talk about my work, and so yeah, those are the best places to find me.
And subscribe to the Lance, her newsletter, and also the book is out tomorrow, so you'll be able to pick that up. And I highly recommend it as a freelancer myself. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Anna.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
Of course.
Bye. Bye.